James today as the church, because he's got one more thing for us to really get. So it's our last week in the book of James. Before we dive in, I really want to give you a reminder of where the church is that's hearing this. See, because the church in the first century has been through quite a bit. You know, we have this incredible moment at Pentecost where thousands of people give their lives to Jesus, and then we have another moment just a little bit later where thousands more give their life to Jesus, and you start to see this church emerge from Jesus' life and ministry through what the apostles are doing. And then, almost at the same time that the church is born, we see persecution start. And it gets to the point to where a young man named Stephen is stoned to death for his belief. He calls out the Jewish leadership and says, "This is what you did to the Messiah." He goes through the whole process with them, and their reaction is to throw rocks at his head until he's dead. And after that, the persecution begins in earnest, and the church, which was kind of situated in Jerusalem, scatters across the world. And so James writes his letter to all of those Christians that were scattered. And it's interesting, though, because you see the church, like, they leave their homes. They leave their lives. They leave everything that's going on. And the reason that they leave is because Jesus matters more. It's not like, okay, never mind, I thought I was good for this, but it turns out that it's a little too pricey for me. I really like my home in Jerusalem. I think I'm going to stay here. No, and I'm sure that there may have been a couple that did that, but really what happens is the church scatters because they realize what they have in Jesus, and they see what their life was like before that, and they say, I want this in exile more than I want that in safety. And so they run, and they hide, and they begin to meet together in these towns. And so James writes this letter to them. And I like it because he starts right in their struggle. See, it's a letter that calls them and invites them to the next step of their faith, which is allowing Jesus to change their lives, to transform their actions, their thoughts, their practices. And so James begins by starting right where they are. He addresses their struggle. Because even if you run and choose Jesus over your comfort, that doesn't make it easy. And so James starts right there with them. And he tells them to reframe their thoughts. He says, consider it pure joy, meaning change your mind about this. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because it's through the testing of your faith that you develop perseverance. He tells them to reframe their thoughts, to see their struggles through the eyes of the eternal kingdom. And that theme keeps going as James addresses how they're supposed to think about how they treat people, how they're supposed to think about and act on their faith, how they're supposed to think about and change the words that come out of their mouths, how they're supposed to think about worldly wisdom over godly wisdom, the values of the kingdom versus the values of the world. And now James finishes his letter to the church by once again coming back to where we found us at the beginning, by addressing the suffering of the church. And I like it because what James really does in this book is he starts right where they are, and he speaks into it, and then he gives them a lot of wisdom for daily living, and then he comes right back to apply it again to their lives. He said, I hit you, I acknowledge where you're at. Here's all this stuff that you really need to get. This is part of the transformed life that we are given through Jesus Christ. And then he finishes by saying, and then right back where they are, here's how we address it. And so today we're coming right back to the idea of suffering. And so we're going to pick it up in James 5, starting in verse 7. It says this, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." Okay. He had just finished this whole section talking about rich people and people that were taking advantage of the church and those kind of things, and that God was eventually, he gives this image of God is going to make things right. But then in verse 7, he says, "So be patient, my dear brothers, until the coming of the Lord." So he brings them right back to their current situation, and he says, be patient because the Lord is coming. And then he gives them three pictures that really do give us some tools in being patient in difficult times. And the first one is in the second half of this, James chapter 5:7. It says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. Be patient about it, or being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. He gives this image of a farmer. There was one time I had this great idea as a youth pastor. I wanted to do this end of summer bash out in the middle of this cornfield. And so the farmer, it was already past his harvest time, and so he got out there and he did this big old circle for us, and we put the fire pit right in the middle of it. And I get out there a couple hours beforehand, and we're getting everything set up. We got hay bales all the way around the fire, and we're gonna have a weenie roast. We're gonna have drinks, and it's just gonna be a really fun night. We're talking about a couple different things we can do, and it was gonna be a fun night. And so as we're getting ready, it comes time to start the fire, and I like fire. I don't like setting things on fire, but I enjoy fire. Like it's pretty to watch when it's under control. And so we start the fire, and it's going pretty well. And then the farmer that we were working with, a guy named Dan, but yeah, there you are. The farmer that we're working with, he says, "Oh, I forgot the shovel." And I said, "Why do we need a shovel?" And he goes, "Oh, just in case the fire gets a little bit out of hand, you take a shovel, put some dirt on it." And I said, "Oh, okay." He goes, "I'm going to drive back up to the house and get the shovel." And so he hops in his little side-by-side, and he drives back up to his house, which is about 5 minutes to get to the house and about 5 minutes to get back. So it's only about 10 to 12 minutes that I'm going to be alone. But no sooner does he clear the horizon than I'm watching the fire and just thinking, man, this is going to be a good night. I'm excited about this. And I walk around it, and I notice that underneath the fire pit, it has started to spread out. And this is a field that's already been harvested, but it's got a lot of very flammable stuff still on the ground. And I'm like, oh, that's not good. And so I walk up and I stomp it out. I'm like, okay, we're fine. And then I walk back and there's fire going out the other side too. I'm like, okay, well, that's not good. And so I stomp that out. And then I look over and there's fire that's like 6 feet beyond it now on the other side. And so I just frantically start stomping out fires. And then I look around and I see that one of the fires is getting close to our line of hay bales that are just kindling. And so I'm like, we're going to burn this whole field down. And so I am panicked, running around, stomping out every fire that I can. By the time he got back with the shovel, it had gone, I had been throwing hay bales out of the way. It had gone 20 feet beyond the fire ring. And my shoes, the soles of my shoes were completely melted. I had no hair on my legs. And I was just in hysterics by the time that he got back there with the shovel. And he thought it was the funniest thing in the world. He laughed himself silly. And I was so mad. Because the truth was, I was terrified. And that's really what we do when we find ourselves in situations that are so far beyond our control and it seems like everything's about to go up in flames. We just get in this mode where we just go hyperactive trying to control what's happening. And we get terrified. James uses this example of a farmer, which is such a great example because farmers face so many things that really affect them but are out of their control. If there's too little rain, the crops die. If there's too much, the crops rot. They're affected by temperature, fire, hail, and a number of other variables. And all of it affects their bottom line of them being able to feed their families. There's so much that is up in the air that farmers cannot control. And so James uses this illustration of the farmer and he says, guys, be patient. Be expectant. Because the Lord is coming. And for me, I just knew that I had a friend coming with a shovel that was going to help put these things out. But at the same time, I was very impatient waiting for him to arrive back. It's the longest 12 minutes that I had experienced in a long while. He says, be patient. And then he says, because look at the farmer. He waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until he receives the early and the late rains. What he's saying is he doesn't have anything under his control, and so he patiently waits. And that's the call that he gives to the church. And so the first point of the day is this, that we need to trust God with what you can't control. And that's a really hard thing to do. If you're a parent, That is a hard thing to do. If you're single and you're waiting, that's a hard thing to do. If you are sick, that's a hard thing to do. If you've got issues going on with your job, if you've got issues going on with your car, all these different things, it's hard to patiently wait when you are not in control of what's going on in your life. We're people who like to act. And so we want to act quickly, and we want to work hard, and we want to make sure that we're controlling everything in our lives. And when we can't control it and it's going out, we sometimes lose our minds a little bit. So when you can't control it, trust God. Surrender it over to Him. And then he continues in James chapter 5, verse 9, and he gives us another picture. He says, "Don't grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." And this may seem like a big left turn. Like he just talks about being patient whenever you're struggling, and then he gives this great picture of a farmer, and then he goes right into, don't grumble. And it seems like it doesn't connect, but hear the connection on this. Ready? Because he just told us, whenever things are completely out of your control, trust God. But what is something that you can control? Your mouth. You can control how you react to the situations that you're in. And so what James says is, trust God when you can't control stuff, but when you can control something, trust God with that too. He says, like a farmer trusts in the coming rain, we need to trust God in and for the things that are out of our control. But then he says, the Lord is coming. There's a lot you can't control, but when it comes to your mouth, you can control it. And so the next point is this: trust God with what you can control. You know, God's not just there to be the Lord over the parts of your life that are out of your control. He's not just there to fill in the gaps where you can't. He is Lord over all. It's one of those things, there's a quote by C.S. Lewis that said, a lot of people think that whenever you enter into a relationship with Jesus, it's, I'm going to stop doing the bad things in my life and I'm going to keep doing the good things in my life, and that's how we're going to approach it. C.S. Lewis says, nope, that's not right. God doesn't want you to be like a tree where He cuts off your bad branches and He lets your good branches flourish. He wants you to give the whole tree to Him. And He wants to tear it completely down to its most base element and then replant it and grow it for His purposes in His garden. It's not just letting God be the Lord of the things that are out of our control. It's a lot easier to trust God sometimes with stuff we can't control, because we can't do it. So we just give it up and we say, God, only you, and that's fine, and that's beautiful. But then when it comes to the stuff we can't control, that's where we say, God, I got this now, you're good. And God's like, man, you don't get it. And so the second point that we get from James is this: trust God with what you can control. You may not be able to trust or be able to control all of your circumstances, but we can control the words of our mouths. We can control what we say about our circumstances. You can control whether or not you choose joy over cynicism. And no, you can't control the way that people treat you, but you can control how you react to the way people treat you. 1 Corinthians 4:12 gives us this example. It's the reality that the disciples were facing and how they handled ridicule. What it says is, when reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We've become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. Basically, they said, for the purposes of Christ and the sake of the gospel, we take ourselves out of the equation. Oh, that's hard. When faced with unfair circumstance and persecution, they took the path that said, this is bigger, the kingdom is bigger than how this affects me. My point in this world is so much more important than just me being justified in this moment. This is bigger than how it affects me. And we see that in action in the book of Acts. There's this story, it's a great story, where Paul and Silas are working through their town in Philippi, and they come across this young girl who's possessed by a demon, and it gives her the power to see the future. And they start coming into the town, and she starts screaming about how these are prophets of the risen Lord and all this different stuff. And she is so persistent with that it annoys them. And so it's like the first time in Scripture you're going to see somebody exorcise a demon because they're annoyed by it. But she's walking around yelling after them, and finally they're like, "Demon, come out of that person!" And the demon leaves her, and she's good now. But then the guy who's kind of her owner looks at that and realizes, I'm not going to make any more money. And so he gets a mob together. And he brings them before the magistrate, and he brings up a false charge against them, saying they're telling us to do things that aren't right for Romans to do, and all this different stuff. And so the magistrate has Paul and Silas beaten with rods and then stuck in prison. And this is where we're going to pick up the story, because at this point, they get stuck in this prison, and they tell the Philippian jailer, they say, "Hey, do not let them escape." Basically is what they say. We're going to pick it up. It's going to be in Acts chapter 16, verse 25. It says, about midnight. Okay, time out real quick. So they tell the Philippian jailer, don't let them escape. And so the jailer takes them back to their cell, and he puts their feet in stocks, which I've been told are really super comfortable. And so about midnight, meaning they've been in these for a while now, Paul and Silas are praying and singing hymns to God. That alone, let's just stop right there. The jailer knows that he is in charge of those people. And I'm sure that he's used to hearing people in stocks, and I don't think that he's used to hearing prayer and praise. But he hears them singing hymns, and then the prisoners were also listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. They had told him, hey, don't let these guys escape. The penalty for letting them escape is death. And it's a shameful death, and it's a hard death. And so he's like, all right, well, these are my options now. Supposing that the prisoners had escaped, but Paul cried out with a loud voice, do not harm yourself, for we are all here. See, the jailer had heard about Paul. It's kind of hard not to. He saw them go into the prison. He placed their legs in stocks, and then he heard them singing praises. Already, that's enough to be perplexing to the Philippian jailer, but when they don't run out of the prison, in essence, when they put his life before their lives, it breaks him. And listen to his response in verse 29. The jailer called for lights and rushed in, and trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out, and he said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? It's one of my favorite stories. Because the point of this story is this, and it fits right in with what we're talking about. Your reactions to difficult times can earn you the opportunity to share the gospel. Sharing the gospel is a whole lot more than knocking on the door of random people and having a conversation for the first time where you're just trying to shove the gospel in their face. Really, it's about earning the right to speak the truth into somebody's life. And nothing will earn you the right to do that faster than controlling the way you react to the world. I don't know if you're paying attention. I'm sure you are. But if you're going to be a follower of Christ, a legitimate follower of Christ in this world today, you're going to get ridiculed more and more as we go forward. It is so important that we react well. Because in our reactions, we can earn the right to share the gospel. It's bigger than us. And for the cause of Christ, we remove ourselves from the equation. Meaning we are unoffendable because it's not about us. James gives a picture of faith when we're not in control, faith when we are in control. And now, in verse 10 of James chapter 5, he gives us an example to follow. He says it's an example of suffering and patience. Brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we considered those blessed who remained steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord and how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Basically, he says, guys, look at the people that we respect now, that we hold up in high regard. These are people that went through incredible suffering, and we hold them in high regard because they remained steadfast. And what he says is this: let their example become your story. The difference between them and you is that they are now done with their suffering and you're in the middle of it. Remain steadfast. Let their example become your story. See, our reactions matter. And we're able as Christians to react correctly when we'd rather not, because we know what comes next. It's the same idea of like a football game. You don't care what the score is at the halftime if you know what the score is going to be at the end of the game. It's like, whenever you watch ESPN Classic and they show a game from a long time ago, you're like, there's going to be a comeback in third quarter. We already know it. We're okay. That's the idea. We know how the story ends, and because we know how the story ends, we are able to see it from the perspective of the eternal and react correctly. James 5:7a, right back in there again. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. We know that Jesus is coming. But here's the thing. We live in a broken world. Today's 9/11. It's one of those things, most people, if you were alive in 9/11, which is crazy to me that there's people that weren't, but, that was 21 years ago now. It's amazing to me when you think of your stories of where you were on the day. I was a freshman in high school. I got to see, a little overshare maybe, but I was faking sick at home that day. And my dad called me from work and he said, hey, and I tried to make my voice sound sick. Like, hello? And my dad said, I know you're faking. Turn on the TV. History's happening. And I turned on the TV, and I got to witness the broken world. I turned it on 3 minutes before the second plane hit. There was fear that day. I got to see evil and brokenness right on my television screen, and it hasn't gotten better since. We have pandemics, shootings, bombings, wars, sickness, tragedy, divorce, broken families. You don't have to look far to see the brokenness of this world. And it's not just on our news, it's in our communities, it's in our families, it's in our marriages, it's in the way that we treat each other. It's not just the world that's broken. Church, we are broken. We are part of the brokenness in this world, and we cannot piece ourselves back together. And as we look around and we see the symptoms of our brokenness, sometimes it fills us with sorrow, sometimes it fills us with outright anger, sometimes it fills us with rage. Sometimes it overwhelms us because it's so far out of our control, and we feel like we're just running around trying to keep the field from burning up. But we don't despair. Hear me on this, please. You can be sorrowful. You can be angry. You can be overwhelmed. But as Christians, as the church, as people who follow Jesus Christ, we do not despair, because to despair is to say that we have no hope, and we do have a hope. We have an eternal hope, so we don't despair because we know the hope of Christ. We know the end of the story, but sometimes in the middle of the story, it can get so bad that we lift our eyes to God and we ask Him, when is this going to end? When are you going to make it right? When are you going to make it better? Have you not seen enough yet? And James hits right on this. He meets the church in the middle of the suffering. He gives them some pictures to see and encourage. But then he lands on the Christian response to the worst of it. It's in chapter 5, verse 13. It says, if you're suffering, let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praises. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. So his response to the church is, when you're in the middle of all of this, what is our reaction in the middle of the brokenness of our world? And he says, church, when you're in the middle of all of it, what do? You pray. When you're suffering, pray. When it's not in your control, you pray. When you're full of joys, you praise. When you're sick, when you're overwhelmed, when you struggle to hold on to hope, you pray. You bring in elders and brothers and sisters to be a people of prayer. And that's really a message that doesn't fly today, because so often Christians are known for being the people that when something horrible happens on social media, first thing we'll type in is thoughts and prayers. And so many times, every tragedy that we've seen in the social media era, whenever it says thoughts and prayers, it's almost immediately met by a couple of different other posts that talk about how ridiculous it is just to say thoughts and prayers. That it's a cop-out. That it's just a way to make yourself feel better and move on. Now, let me be clear. If you use thoughts and prayers as an excuse to not get involved, then yeah, you've missed the point of it. But the prayer of faith in times of difficulty, when things are out of our control, when we are overwhelmed, when we are just broken at the thought of the world and seeing everything that's happening, not just in the world, but in our own lives too. The prayer of faith is not a passive thing. It's not an empty platitude. We are saying that we are placing this large thing, this thing that is bigger than us, we're taking it and we're placing it in the hands of the Father who can do more than we can do. And James 5:17 tells us this. He says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, meaning Elijah's just like us. And then he prayed fervently that it might not rain for 3 years and 6 months, and it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. He said, guys, you serve a God that is bigger than this world. This is a God who's powerful enough to control the weather, who's faithful to Elijah, and is faithful still. So to surrender something to prayer, to honestly surrender it to prayer, is not a cop-out. It's the single greatest action we can take as believers. It's an honor to tell somebody that I am surrendering this to God. We're saying that something is beyond us, and so we're putting it in the hands of the Creator of the universe. It's like if somebody came up to me and said, I'm really struggling with heart failure. And I could say, okay, hold on, let me go get my X-Acto knife and I'll see if I can get in there and do anything to help you. No, I'm not going to do that. But what I'm going to do is say, hey, let's go talk to a heart surgeon who can really help you. Whenever we see things in our world that are completely out of our control, we could say, okay, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to step into it. But no, because we know it's beyond us. And so we give it to the God who is powerful enough to handle it. Who is that? It's not an excuse for apathy. It's not an excuse to just push something aside and not let it hit you. It's not an excuse not to get involved. It's an understanding that God can do more than we can. In prayer, we take our concerns from our incapable hands and put them in the more than capable hands of the Father. But when we do it, we're also, hear this, we are also submitting ourselves to act in whatever way the will of God would have us act. That's why we say in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What we're saying in that is this: God, I want your will to be done, and I want to be an agent of your will in this world. Prayer is a surrender, but it's also a submission. We want his kingdom to come and his will to be done. And it means that we want his will to be done through and in our lives as well. So if we're going to be the people that God has called us to be, then we're called to live a life that is lived out in prayer.